UN human rights monitors have documented what appear to be deliberate and brutally violent attacks on civilians, particularly against women and children, by government and aligned forces, as well as armed youth in parts of Unity State in South Sudan. Victims and witnesses describe how the SPLA and aligned forces would storm into villages in the early morning around dawn, surround the village, and start shooting at fleeing civilians. The attackers would then steal cattle, loot entire households, and burn down houses and food stocks. Civilians were targeted, with the elderly, people with disabilities, and very young children killed in horrific acts of violence. Some hung from trees, and others burned alive in their own homes. This is what our investigation has found. We found that between the 16th of April and the 24th of May, at least 232 civilians were killed, and many more were injured in attacks by government and aligned forces and armed youth on these villages in opposition-controlled areas in Mayandit and Lear. The report also documents the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, with at least 120 women and girls raped or gang-raped, including children as young as 4. One 20-year-old woman was still bleeding from childbirth when she was raped. Some of those who resisted were shot dead. At least 132 other women and girls were abducted. The brutality and ruthlessness of the attackers, as described by the survivors, suggests their intent was to take a scorched earth approach, killing or forcibly displacing people, burning their crops and homes, punishing and terrorizing them to ensure that they never return. Many fled under attack by gunfire and shelling, and some of the corpses seen by human rights monitors in the villages on the 12th of May exhibited bullet wounds in their backs. According to the information we've received, the elderly, sick, and people with disabilities who were unable to flee were often burnt alive. The report documents acts that constitute gross violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law that may amount to war crimes. The investigation has also identified 3 individuals who may bear the greatest responsibility for the violations committed. Some 31,140 people were internally displaced just as a result of this military offensive. We are calling on the government to halt all attacks against civilians and to launch investigations. The perpetrators of these revolting acts against defenseless civilians, including those bearing command responsibility, must not be allowed to get away with it. There must be consequences for the men who reportedly gang-raped a 6-year-old child, who slit the throats of elderly villagers, who hanged women for resisting looting and shot fleeing civilians in the swamps where they hid. Those who ordered and facilitated these horrific crimes must be brought to account. The government of South Sudan and the international community have a responsibility to ensure justice. We also call on the Transitional Government of National Unity in South Sudan, as well as the African Union, to move quickly towards establishing the hybrid court for South Sudan to ensure accountability for gross human rights violations.
Nick, go ahead.
Ravina, what can you tell us about these 3 individuals?
Let me just find the information. One of the individuals, and this is a somewhat welcome development, one of the individuals has now been reportedly removed from his functions as a result of this. I understand that the 3 individuals were commanders who were shown to be actually in control of the armed forces. Now, these armed forces are government forces, allied forces. So you've got, for example, one of the opposition forces which changed its alliances and is now working with the government, as well as armed youth. What we have found is that in most circumstances, these aligned forces and the armed youth are actually in the under the control of army commanders.
But there's been no attempt to apprehend them or detain them. And I mean, what do you think the prospects are for any kind of accountability, given the sort of supposed new efforts at a reconciliation between the two leaders?
Yeah, no, so we've made our findings, we've shared our findings with the government of South Sudan, and we've been engaging with them on this quite robustly. You'll see that the report covers the period until the 24th of May. Once the report was finalized, we've then been sharing it with the government, engaging with them, and we understand that this has resulted in one of these commanders being removed from his functions for his implication in these violations. We've also received reports that he may be under house arrest, but we haven't been able to confirm these reports yet. So there does seem to be some movement. We are encouraged by this, and we hope that there will be stronger, more robust, and more of such actions.
Nina, go ahead.
Hi, Ravina. I'm just wondering, you're talking about a systematic campaign basically to get these people out. Is there an ethnic cleansing element to this? You're talking about possible war crimes. Is there also a possibility of crimes against humanity here?
Yeah, no, as you know, the conflict in South Sudan has long had a very strong ethnic element to it. Now, in this particular case, we found that the villages were attacked because they were perceived to be supporting the opposition. They were believed to be in under the control of the opposition. In many cases, what we found is that there was absolutely no resistance that was put forward by the opposition in these villages. However, it appears that there was a kind of systematic, intentional, deliberate attempt to punish the civilians, to remove them from these villages and to take effective control of these villages. So there is always an ethnic element in the conflict in South Sudan, but this one really was about gaining control of perceived opposition-controlled areas.
Lisa.
There have been many brutal and atrocious attacks throughout this terrible war. Is this the worst? Is this something that has crossed a certain line?
I wish I could say that this was the worst, but no, this is consistent with a pattern of violations that we have seen in South Sudan. The killings and the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, this is consistent with the kinds of violations we've seen.
This attack occurred, I don't have in front of me, so I'm not sure if I have the information correct here, but occurred before this last peace agreement, which apparently is failing or has already failed, was adopted, right? So I don't know whether there was any kind of relationship between the possibility of having a peace agreement and this attack in terms of the timing.
My understanding is that we often see heightened attacks during the dry season. So it has more to do with the weather than it has to do with the peace process, is my understanding. During the monsoons, the roads are blocked. It's more difficult to be able to reach many of these remote villages. So during the dry season, you tend to see a heightened level of attacks. Government and allied forces and armed youth on these villages in opposition